Welcome to another episode of Event Heroes. My name is Ketan, and today we are going to be speaking about designing feedback loops for B2B marketing events with Alex. Alex, welcome to the show.
Hi, Ketan. Thanks very much for having me.
Sure, Alex. So why don't we start with you telling us a little bit about yourself and Explory?
Sure, yeah. So, hi everybody. Good evening from the UK. It's about 6:30 here. Good morning to everybody in the US. My name's Alex. I'm the Senior Corporate Relations Manager at Explory. For those of you who don't know what Explory are, we're an event research firm specializing in feedbacks for the events industry. So we help corporate event planners and exhibition organizers around the world to close the feedback loop and make better use of their feedback data and help them use that in their strategy so that they can improve the experiences for attendees. So like everybody who's on this call right on the session right now.
And awesome. How has 2023 been so far? I think this is the last quarter when I can ask that question. But have you attended any interesting events so far?
Yeah, it's been a couple so far, which has been great actually. So I was at the CNIT Corporate Forums in London in January, which is the first event I went to for this year, which was amazing. It was so good to actually be back in person and seeing people, meeting people. And then a couple of weeks ago had a second event in Chicago of all places, which was a lot of fun. My first time there, and it was very, very cold. I can say that it was like minus 25. Celsius, which I don't even know what's that, like -2 Fahrenheit or something.
Yeah.
It was a bit fresh, but apart from the cold, the event actually was really, really well. That was the Event Leaders Exchange annual congress that we were running on there, which was first time for that, and it was amazing.
Yeah, Chicago in January is not very welcoming.
No, not so much. I mean, the UK in January is not necessarily welcoming either. We have a lot of rain and misery, but over there they do a lot of things well in Chicago, and cold is one of them.
Yeah. Awesome. So interestingly, Alex, I know that you're a lead instructor with the Professional Association of Diving Instructors, right? So how did diving happen?
Yeah, that's right. So I'm a master scuba diver, or I was a master scuba diver trainer for PADI, and I did that kind of straight out of university. Really, I didn't feel like getting a proper job, and I thought, oh, well, what can I do that is actually going to be exciting and allows me to travel a little bit? So I ended up in Vietnam and Thailand, Cambodia, teaching diving for a couple of years, which was fantastic fun. Very different to living in central London. I'll tell you that we don't have that many beaches down here, but it was a phenomenal experience to be able to have the opportunity to do that.
Wow. So I mean, it's one of those spaces where feedback becomes very, very critical, right? I mean, I know this is a segue into our conversation, but your feedback from your equipment, feedback from co-divers, feedback from the water. Have you been in a situation where like critical feedback saved a life or saved a major mishap from happening?
I think it's hard. There have been a couple of scary situations. When you're 130 feet underwater and one of your students decides to freak out, and they don't necessarily know the consequences, but you very much do know what happens if it goes wrong at that depth. So it's more about communication. I think when you're under there, because you basically have your hands and you have your eyes, and that's the way that you communicate. And getting, as opposed to your point, feedback from your students, from your buddy, to make sure that they are comfortable and you can kind of read exactly what they're doing. But in those scenarios, you're trained very, very well to, in kind of instructor scenarios to make sure that mishaps don't happen. But you're right. Yeah, there's a lot of kind of feedback around the way that the dive site is operating, the way that the currents are working. You've got your depth gauges, you've got your timers and everything to make sure that you're within your planned dive, because when you get to that depth, you need to make sure that everything kind of runs like clockwork, to the point where I imagine, like an event, you spend months and months planning for it, then you execute it, but inevitably on the day something goes wrong. And so sometimes that happens with diving. I mean, more often it's more often that things go absolutely perfect, but occasionally, things do go a little bit pear-shaped.
Yeah, and from diving to not to a less dangerous topic, but equally thrilling and exciting and stressful events, right? You've been with events for quite a while now, right? With Exposes, VSAF, and now with Explory. You've always been in your majority of your career, right, has been with in a customer facing role as an instructor, I
Yeah.
imagine, sales, customer success, right? So how has the measurement of consumer experience in that space kind of changed over the past few years?
Um, I think, like, at least within my experience, I've, like you said, I've been on the the tourism side of customer facing, and then kind of now moved into B2B event for the last kind of like 5 or 6 years. So there's different approaches that you take depending on the medium in which your customer sits, right? So for events, obviously it's sitting in the medium of events. If it's you're looking at any type of customer facing business, then however your consumers are kind of interacting with your products. So gathering feedback from your customers has always been, it's been something we've been doing for ages. I think like the first survey was done in like the 1830s or something like that, where people, you had people with clipboards walking around houses. I think it was in Manchester or something, just trying to like figure out who was doing what. And so ever since then, we've kind of, it's always been the best method, a survey that is, to research your customers. And for events, you have two types of customers. You have your attendees, and then for trade shows, you have both your attendees and your exhibitors. So there's different ways and different research methodologies to capture that data. And in terms of how it's changed over time, technology, it's moving from pen and paper, somebody face to face, literally saying, can you rate this, to being delivered an email, or you're tapping a feedback form on your phone if you're at an event, or when you're at the airport or something, when you're pressing the smiley faces or something like that. There's so many different ways of capturing feedback these days, and technology has been a driver for that, for sure.
Yeah, and some of these event organizers are still stuck in the 1800s, I believe. Not too long ago, I do remember it was a large conference, a well-known conference, and somebody just gave me a piece of paper to give my feedback on. And I didn't mind doing that, but I never heard from them. I don't know what happened to the feedback. So yeah, while feedback has evolved as an art and a science, some people have not moved on. But yeah, here's hoping they do.
Yeah, I mean, it is still the case that there are event experiences out there that are being measured purely just by paper forms. I mean, nowadays technology is relatively affordable when it comes to using online survey technology, but some people just enjoy that face-to-face experience. But I would say if you're going to do the face-to-face kind of paper, or more like analog, I should say, gathering feedback, then do it in the form of an interview where you're having an actual conversation with the person, because it's going to be so much more useful for you long term. And it means that you don't have some some poor employee who's having to like type up 400 sheet forms of questions, something like that. I mean, if that's what happens, then I'm not surprised that nobody got back to you and told you the results of the feedback. It obviously just wasn't in their strategy to do that as effectively as they could.
Yeah, and with feedbacks, it's always a lagging indicator. Yeah. You really don't know if you had a successful event until the feedback starts flowing in, right? And it's not just about the agenda or the speakers anymore. It's about the whole experience.
Yeah, events are all encompassing. It's not just you have to gather feedback at after somebody's had an opportunity to experience the entire event, and kind of digest that entire experience and engagement with that particular brand or that particular business or whatever it might be. So yeah, it's while it is a lagging indicator in the sense that obviously you're only understanding what has happened, or how what has happened has been impacted, you can use feedback and survey questions to look forward. And there are correlations, especially within the data set that we have at Explory, and we've done some research with UFI as well, who are the global association for the exhibition industry, that certain metrics, so certain questions that are being asked, do have a predictive nature. And that's why it's actually so important to gather feedback, because if you just look at attendee numbers, there's no guarantee that if you got 5,000 attendees this year that you're going to get 5,000 attendees next year, right? Just by looking at the attendee numbers, or even if you just look at something like revenue, that's a lagging indicator. But by looking at like customer experience data, if you deliver a fantastic experience, that gives you the best kind of opportunity to deliver a better experience next year, and then you're more likely to get people to come back. So there are kind of forward-looking indicators that you can place and weave into your survey questions or your feedback forms.
Okay, and just from getting into the thick of things, right? What should one consider when they're designing feedback, right? What are the things to keep in mind?
I think if you strip it all the way back, the first thing that I would always kind of advise people to do when they're thinking about their post-event feedback would be, think about your objectives first. Why are you putting the event on, right? What's the purpose of it? And what are you as a planner or the organizer trying to help your attendees achieve, right? Because that should be the goal, is that then you can start to look at, right, what are the metrics that are important to you? For instance, if you take like a corporate event, if it's an internal training event, then asking how likely you are to return to that event doesn't mean anything, because it's a mandatory company event, right? That metric doesn't mean anything. But really what you want to understand is whether people, as a result of attending that event and that experience, may feel more positively towards the company or the brand as a whole, right? That would be a great metric or something to put in the survey. So I think the first thing would be to think about your objectives, design your questions around, right, how can we understand how people have met the objectives that we want them to meet, and then designing the survey from there and cutting out things that don't actually matter. Surveys are or feedback forms historically have got a bit of a bad press, and are generally treated in exactly. You laugh, but it's true. And so they're generally treated as like tactical exercises for marketers to go, oh, well, 90% of people were satisfied, or, so and so many people said that it was a great event, or whatever it might be, right? Whereas if you ask the right questions, as I was talking a minute ago about forward-looking metrics, you can, it's such a rich data source, and it can be so strategic for your business. So asking the right questions is really, really crucial, and thinking about, what you're actually going to do with the answers. Don't ask a question that you don't either want the answer to, or you're not going to use the answer to. So a lot of people will ask questions about, whether the Wi-Fi was good or whether the food was good. In some instances, yes, it's important to ask those questions, but sometimes it's just not. Attendees don't. They're the things that you can't change, right? Ask questions about the parts of the experience that you as the planner can influence and make changes towards. That would be, a must-have for me.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is less is more one. You've got to tie everything back to the goals that you have for putting that event in the first place. And it's all right not to ask about every little detail. You've got to pick the top 5, top 6, whatever number that you have, and go after that.
It doesn't have to be like, I'm going to limit myself to 5 questions around this, or 10 questions around that, or even just limiting the survey to, no more than 20 questions, because you'd be surprised how many questions people are willing to answer if they're engaged with the experience and they believe that their feedback actually matters. So, in terms of actually delivery, deliver the survey as soon as you have delivered the event, after the event, and then also communicate your findings back to your audience. Because for me, how many times have you been to, like you said, you went to an event, the survey was on paper, you never heard from them before. Even if you went back to that event, you'd have no belief or trust that your feedback actually mattered. And experiences and events are designed, or supposed to be designed, for the people who are attending them, right? So they're part of, if you can help people engage with the feedback process, they feel like they're part of building that experience and building that event, and they're more likely to give you not just more feedback, but more honest feedback, which is, the organizer and the planner is going to be immensely valuable for you when you're trying to, curate that experience year after year. So yeah, there's a couple of different points there.
Yeah. No, just double clicking on what you said about figuring out what's important, right? Is there such a thing as an absolute must have on a survey question, or does that completely depend on the goals of your event and the format?
Is there an absolute must have? I think for us, I would say that always have a question around satisfaction. So overall, how satisfied were you with the event? Net promoter score is a great metric. It can be a little bit of a red herring sometimes, so I would always use it as part of a variety of metrics to use. Don't just use that one by itself, because NPS is a measure of advocacy, right? It's how likely you are to recommend the event, and how likely you are to recommend the event is not always indicative of how successful that event has been at meeting an attendee's objectives or the planner's objectives, right? So I'd always use it as part of a suite. So probably things like overall satisfaction, net promoter score. If you're a trade show, using likelihood to return, so a loyalty question. If you're a corporate event where it's more mandatory, if it's internal, then using a metric like value for time can be really, really valuable for you to use. So yeah, those would be the ones that I would probably look at the most.
Yeah, and so I used to work at a startup where we had built a tool for measuring NPS, right? And the biggest problem, like you said, with measuring NPS is that just the score doesn't tell you anything, right? So we started building an analytical model around the text that come, the comments that come along with that accompany the score, right? Which is actually where the meat of the matter is, right? So we did find a lot of value from that. But I imagine for a larger event where you've got tens of thousands of people, like an IMAX, for example, running running an NPS plus with the comment section, that's a huge undertaking. How does somebody go about analyzing feedback like that?
That's it's an interesting question. IMAX, funnily enough, they're one of the events that we work on, and they do a phenomenal job. It's a brilliant event, and they take their feedback really, really seriously. And I think the way that they go about it is, making sure that they're just taking the time to dig into the scores. If you just take NPS, for instance, right, you've got your detractors scoring 0 to 6, your passives in 7 and 8, and then you've got your promoters in 9 and 10. Now, just because somebody scores, for us, perceptually scoring a 7 or an 8 out of 10 is actually a pretty high score, but you kind of get cut out of the analysis, I suppose, or at least the overall score, because the net promoter score is promoters minus detractors, or the difference between the two. So passives are kind of like, supposedly they're sat on the fence, so they don't make much of an impact. Yes. But not always. That's not always the case. There are, there's softwares out there that allow you to put in text, and then they draw kind of conclusions based on language. So it's the AI software that does that, or machine learning software that kind of draws out themes, especially. So that's something that you could do if you've got a huge amount of comments. The other thing would be to actually dig into the score and see, right, do I have like a really high percentage of people who scored 6, right? Still classed in the detractor, but they're 5 points ahead of somebody who scored 1, right? That's a big difference. Figuring out, right, well, maybe I just have a large group of people who actually would consider themselves passives. So let's have a look at people who scored 6. Let's have a look at their comments, and if we can bump them up next year into your 7s and 8s, and your 7s and 8s into your 9s and 10s, then all of a sudden you've got this massive swing upwards as a positive NPS score. But yeah, I think that would be, that's one of the things to dig into, and you do just have to take the time. But like with all of these metrics, it's important to have context. Right? This is why NPS can be quite a red herring if you don't know what good and bad looks like, because you might have your NPS for an event might be -10, right? Minus, typically you go, oh, that's not good. I'm in the negatives. But if the benchmark is -20, right, and you're scoring -10, then that's amazing. You're 10 points above the benchmark, which is incredible. But if the benchmark is +30 and you're -10, well, okay, now there's a big difference. But
That's true.
That's why, and the other thing is, because of the mathematics of how NPS is structured, it can swing massively. So you do see these events who will go from like a +20 to like a +5, in a year, just because a proportion of their audience has shifted from like 7 and 8 to 6, for instance. So yeah, it can be very challenging, but that's why I said use it as part of a suite of metrics that measure every aspect or different aspects of the event experience, and then kind of bring those together so that you can actually look at it from a holistic viewpoint.
And should we look at incorporating feedback at every stage of the event? And by that I mean, do we need to collect feedback at the pre-event, during event, post-event phase?
I mean, it depends on what. Probably, I would say not always, because if you're going to use feedback strategically, you need to get feedback from people once they have absorbed and been a part of the entire event experience. Pre-event, nothing has happened. The data that you can collect pre-event would be around pre-registrations or things like that. But again, that only is indicative of like how many people are kind of visiting or due to visit, come to the event. Then in event feedback, I mean, everybody for trade shows, definitely salespeople will walk around the floor and chat to their clients, their exhibitors there, and kind of get feedback on the floor, which is always a good way. That's also a relationship building exercise, so people you get a little bit of face time. But again, if you're gathering feedback at an event, whether it be a corporate event or whether it be a trade show, and if it's the morning or the afternoon of the first day, for instance, then somebody might have had a fantastic time at the end of day one, but by the time they finish day 3, well, it wasn't that great. So it skews your view a little bit. That's the challenge with doing any kind of on-site research, is that it's fantastic to get like an in-the-moment viewpoint of it, but people haven't had a chance to digest and absorb the entire experience. So their viewpoint on day 1 will be different from day 3, and maybe different from day 4, which is when you would send out the survey if it's a 3-day event. So yeah, there are some complexities around doing, gathering specifically feedback at on-site an event. Gathering data at an event in terms of tracking data, that's a different story, because there's technology now to track where people go within the event, and you can use that to enhance your viewpoint and enhance your analysis, because you can link it to your feedback data afterwards to see if, let's say, if certain people attended a certain session, whether they were more or less satisfied than somebody who had attended a different session, for instance. Now that's really key insight. But even still, that it's still dependent on you delivering or gathering feedback post-event. So I think feedback, pre and in event, not the most strategic, asset to you. Post-event feedback is by far and above the most strategic asset you have for an event organizer or an event planner.
Awesome. So I imagine this is where feedback, over feedback starts becoming annoying as opposed to useful, right? So there is such a thing as too many questions or too much feedback, or asking too much feedback.
It goes back to what I said before. Don't ask questions that you don't want to know the answer to. Like everything, event planners and event organizers, we're in such a privileged position. We have so much data at our fingertips, and it's a problem that we've been known in the industry. I imagine it. We deal with data all the time. If you have too much data and you don't have a plan of how to use it, or it's just if it's not joined up, it ends up scrambled. Somebody looks at that and goes, "There's no way I'm spending my time trying to touch that, because it's just not worth it." And so, yes, feedback data, if collected inconsistently, especially across, if you take a corporate event, team, their program, let's say you've got 500 events a year. If you're not collecting feedback consistently, i.e. you're not asking similar questions on the same scale. If you're asking 5-point scales here or 4-point scales over there, you can't compare anything, and therefore the data just gets siloed, in its own event, and it's useless, right? So in that vein, yes, too much can be a bad thing, but it's only a bad thing if you're collecting it inconsistently and you don't have a plan to use it. But if you have like a proper framework for collecting feedback, you're doing it consistently, and you can control that consistency across all of the events that you're planning or organizing, then it doesn't matter how much you get. In fact, the more the better. From a data perspective, the more feedback you get, the more robust your data set is, the deeper you can go on your analysis, the better the insight, and that insight ultimately is what's going to drive your strategy moving forward, because you've got a robust data set to win those arguments, to make those decisions, defend those budgets, and so on and so forth. So that's a really good thing. When it comes to asking questions, well, yes, if you ask 1,000 questions on a survey, for a half-day event, you're not going to get anybody to respond. So that's not good, right? But be smart about how you ask your questions. Again, only ask questions that you want to know the answers to, that are actually going to be useful for you. So yes and no. There is a point where it gets annoying, but overall, I'd say the more data that you have, the more feedback data you have, assuming it is collected correctly and consistently, will be, it's one of the best assets, in your arsenal for an event planner, for sure.
Yeah, you couldn't incentivize me enough to answer more than 5 questions. There's no way I'm going to do that.
Yeah, well, incentives work. I mean, this is the thing, right? So there's an argument to say that incentivizing people on a survey can skew the results, because people might just go click, 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 click. Oh, I just want my £10 Amazon gift card, right? Well, yes, there is part of it that, there is some science to suggest that. But in general, if you incentivize people, it does mean you get a better response rate. It means that people are going to complete the survey. So therefore, it gives you more data, and more data, as we know, means a better level of insight for you to use in your strategy. So I think it's just about choosing what is going to incentivize you, Ketan. I mean, maybe a £10 Amazon gift card just isn't going to do it. So I don't know. What would you want to be incentivized by? What would get you to answer a survey more than 5 questions?
That's interesting. Maybe a higher denomination coupon, or maybe a bottle of wine. That's always a good incentive.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, and so anybody who's running an event and you're their target market, Ketan, this is you. We understand you very well. We know you don't want a £10 gift card. We know you want, a chance to win this fantastic bottle of wine, right? Okay, yes, that's going to get me. So that's a good incentive.
You're right.
So I think on the topic of incentives, planners and organizers know their audience way better than any other kind of research firm or any other kind of survey provider could ever do. We have, for us, we have data to back up, some suggestions we have, but your audience. So choose something, if you're going to incentivize them, choose something that you believe they're actually going to be incentivized by.
Right. So it's not doing it for the heck of doing it, but it's really well thought of, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's, if you can't think of anything, or your audience just isn't really, isn't a wine drinking specific audience for you, then choose something a little bit more generic, like a gift card. It tends to increase response rate enough, especially on smaller events, to get people to complete the survey. So yeah.
Nice, fantastic. And does this feedback have a shelf life?
As in, does it go? As in, like, is it always useful?
No, what I mean is that the value of the insight is directly proportional to the time within which it's implemented, right? So how soon should people act on that feedback? One is, and obviously if it's an annual event, you're going to act on it for the next event likely, right? But for events like this webinar, for instance, right? Yeah. It's a monthly thing, sometimes twice a month. How soon does that feedback start losing value, or does it ever lose value?
That's a really good question. I think that yes, the value will ultimately decrease the further away from the event it is, right? So feedback from an event in 2019 is not going to be as valuable as feedback tomorrow from this webinar, for instance, if you're looking at it proportionally. Feedback, once it has been implemented into your strategy, so you've had your post-show wash-up meeting, you've gone, this is how the event went, this is our feedback. We'll mention the feedback loop in a minute, but once we've actually implemented changes based off what our attendees said, so off the feedback, then you've squeezed as much as you can out of that data set. Now, the other side of the coin is that when tracking performance over time, so if you're looking at the metrics, not necessarily the open-ended part of the feedback questions, but if you're looking at your core metrics, so things like overall satisfaction, net promoter score, value for time, loyalty, if you're looking at behavioral and sentiment impact scores as well, things that can be directly measured over time, then arguably that data doesn't lose value. It actually grows in value, because if you're tracking it over time, you might be able to generate your own benchmarks, internal benchmarks, because you've got everything consistent. But at the very least, you'll be able to track your performance over time. So if you've got historic data, let's say if you just pick one metric, if you just pick net promoter score, you can track that over time for, let's say, the last 3 years or last 4 years, let's say 2 years pre-pandemic, in pandemic, and then now. You've got a historic analysis, so you can see where you came from before the pandemic kind of hit and changed events forever, I think, arguably, to where you are now. That data from 2018, 2019, and beginning of 2020, that's going to be massively valuable for anybody who's running an event now, because they can see where they were, they can see what happened in the middle, and then they can see where they are now. So, and that helps with telling the story of your events, of the success, and how people's expectations have changed. We've seen it with Net Promoter Score, specifically for the expo function. I think it was like +10 or +12 or something like that for attendee Net Promoter Score pre-pandemic. It then, obviously trade shows didn't happen, so it plummeted. The response to the virtual events was horrendous for some and phenomenal for other. It was massively volatile, but then coming out of the other end of it, now it's coming back onto an even keel. So, we're able to take that data and look at it over time. So when you're looking at it from that perspective, it probably increases in value when you're looking at it, when you're looking at your scores and your performance over time. But then there is, once you've used it, I suppose, in your strategy, then most of it is then not redundant, but it becomes, dead data, really. So I suppose the answer to that is yes and no. Yes, some questions like improvements will be redundant after you've used it in your strategy moving forward. And once the next event has run, well, you don't need to use that anymore. But your key metrics that you're tracking over time, they can increase in value over time, because it helps you tell the story, helps you know where you come from, and also predict your future success.
I can actually see a research report come out from just that answer. It's going to be a guide, and we're going to bring out one. Thank you for that. That's detailed. So for somebody starting off building a feedback and doing webinars, right, simple events, do you have any rule of thumbs or any advice of how they should think of building that feedback?
I think the simple answer is just to start. When there's a formula or a methodology called the feedback loop, right? And so that's 5 stages. And most people do the first 2 stages, which are to collect your data, which is simply running a survey, and analyzing that data. So looking at it and seeing if you can draw any trends, right? Step 3 is to share your results internally with the business, so that you can communicate how well that event is done or how well that event hasn't done. And then you need to make decisions. So step 4 is to decide on what you're going to do with that data. What are you going to do to change the event, to improve it based on the feedback that you have received? And then step 5 is to actually implement that. Actually, in the next edition of the event, make the changes that have come out of the research and come out of the analysis you've done of your feedback. And so what we talk about in research is closing that feedback loop, closing it from, you know, one stage, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then repeating that process all over again. So you end up with almost like a virtuous circle of feedback, right? You collect, you analyze, you share, you decide, you implement, and then you go round that loop again. Because once you do that, and you start off small, you don't have to do it with every single event. If you've got 500 events, it's going to be hard to implement this process in one go.
Yeah.
Just start off with one edition of an event, or one business line, or one portfolio, whatever it might be. And yeah, that would be my advice, is just to start and then focus on closing that loop. Because the other thing that we get asked quite a lot is, what's the value of completing surveys? Do people complete surveys? And as I mentioned at the beginning, when people feel like they are part of building that experience, they're going to give you better feedback, they're going to give you more honest feedback, and you're going to get more people giving you that feedback. And the way to drive response rate and drive engagement with surveys and feedback is to complete that feedback loop. Once you have decided that you're going to make a change based on what your audience said, tell your audience that that's what you're going to do. Don't hide from it. Say, you said this, so we're going to go and do that as a result of this. Yeah. And then shout about the changes that you make. Because when people turn up to an event and they realize, oh, hang on a minute, I have actually been listened to, then if something goes wrong or something goes right at the event, then they're going to want to share that with the person who put that event on, and it builds trust. So yeah, that would be the starting place. That would be for me where to start is, first of all, just to get going, start measuring, and as best you can, try and be consistent with at least your core questions, so that you can track over time, regardless of kind of what type of event it is. Always try and ask your key metrics. So your things like your satisfaction, your net promoter score, your value for time questions. If you try and ask 3 or 4 of those key metrics on every single survey in the same way, and make sure that they're always on the survey, then that's going to give you a hugely robust data set to start drawing kind of long-term strategic conclusions, and actually start to evaluate the future health of your event assets and your event programs. So that's kind of long term, but yeah, if you can just start with trying to close that feedback loop and being consistent in the way that you ask questions, then yeah, you're doing more than a lot of the industry at the moment.
Fantastic. And this sounds, because it's a framework, it does sound scalable, right? It doesn't matter if your event becomes 10 times as big, you can still use this framework.
It's the same process whether you've got 100 people at a small conference, or whether you've got 100,000 people at some of the largest at a CES or something like that, or an IMEX, right? It's the same process. The only thing that changes is the scale in which you're delivering that survey, the amount of data you're getting back, and from event to event, the kind of the nuances of the questions that you're asking when it comes to evaluating their experience.
Awesome, fantastic. There are a couple of questions, Alex, that have come in. I'm just going to read them out for you. The first question by Regina is, what are the current benchmarks for customer experiences at events? And I think by that, what Regina means is probably asking, is there an average NPS around events? Is there something like that?
Yeah, so we have we have benchmarks for NPS, for satisfaction, and for the overall performance of both corporate events and trade shows. So for visitors, I believe the benchmark for on the expo side of things for attendees is, I think it's plus 14, I believe, is for that. And then for corporate events, for the attendee net promoter score benchmark is plus 30, so much higher. So, but you can find the UFI Global Visitor Insights Report. I think the last one was done in 2020 or 2021. There's been another report since, which is about the change of NPS, or at least metrics in specifically in the exhibition industry. So that's available on either Explore's website or on UFI's website as well. So the benchmarks are in there, and I believe they're also broken down by region. So you've got North America versus South America, Europe, and Asia have got slight differences in their Net Promoter Score benchmarks.
Yeah, that'd be an interesting report to get our hands on. Okay.
Sure.
The other question is around the building of the feedback. So the question is, what is the ideal length of a feedback question? And this is by Joseph.
I think I would go on how long it takes to complete, right? So rather than the actual number of questions, because you could ask 25, 30 questions, and the survey could be 5 minutes to complete if it's just checkbox answers. If you had 25 questions of all open text, it would take you 3 hours to complete. So I'd probably, go for around the 5 to 10 minute mark, depending on how engaged your audience is. So I would go off how long it takes to complete rather than the number of questions. Obviously, the shorter it is, then the less amount of time it's going to take. The other thing that I would just mention on that is try and be as smart as you can about how you're routing your questions. If you know a lot about your attendee, so in their demographic data, you know their job title, you know where they're from, you might know their objectives for the event. This is for trade show side. For corporate events, you'll know a lot more, but it'll be slightly different. If you can formulate the questions and route the questions so that it almost is asking them to rate parts of the experience that they wanted to achieve, or certain objectives that you already know they wanted to achieve, then it will feel much more tailored and they'll be much more engaged with it. So that's just kind of like a side note on that.
Okay, fantastic. One more question from Regina, and it's what's some of the easiest ways to capture customer feedback, customer feedback, I think.
Yeah, post-event survey. It's a tried and tested method, research method. If there was a better way to capture, attendee sentiment and customer feedback data, we would do it. But it's, it is still the most robust way of capturing that data. So yeah, a survey, simply a survey.
Okay, and I think this is the last one that we can take, with considering we're just hitting the top of the time. How do you present insights to get buy-in from relevant stakeholders?
So to get buy-in from relevant stakeholders, so I think if you're trying to get people to buy into the value of feedback, then present it to them in a really simple way. It's probably my best recommendation, and try as best you can to relate it to their area of the business, right? So if you're speaking to a CFO and they're asking you, right, why are we putting on this event? Well, say to them, present the feedback data in a way that says, well, actually, this is how impactful and how successful this event actually is, compared to how much investment it's taken to put this event on. So if you're kind of, and therefore you're speaking finance, you're speaking the CFO's language, and the same with other parts of the business. So yeah, I try as best I can to try to simplify it and speak their language as much as possible, because as events people, we sometimes get caught in our own little world of events are amazing, and we know events are amazing. Everyone on here, I imagine, knows that events are fantastic. But trying to communicate that to the rest of the business, and especially to people who sign the paycheck, sometimes can be a little tricky. So yeah, speaking their language is probably going to be the best way to do that.
And that's super insightful. Yes, I've had cases where I've had to do that and justify the cost of an event. But I had data, which showed that we got deals converted from those events, so it more than recovered the cost of that event. And yeah, I mean, it was a short discussion because we had data.
Yeah, exactly. When you have the right data in the right place and it tells the story, then it's hard to argue with. And that's why it's absolute madness for me when I hear that there's, events, especially on the corporate side, they're one of the largest budget items in any marketing budget worldwide, especially for the Fortune 500. This is this data from the Gartner CMO report from 2022. The largest line item on a marketing budget, yet they have the least amount of measurements. And so no wonder a CFO is going to look at that and go, hang on a minute, I'm spending how many hundreds of millions on putting that event, but all my other SEO and all my other digital marketing is tracked within an inch of its life. But events are not done like there's been a challenge around doing that. So I think the more that you can measure your events, the more that you can prove how valuable we know as events people they are, then the better it's going to be for the industry, because we'll get more budget, we'll be able to put on better experiences, and ultimately it's just going to drive more businesses forward as a whole.
Yeah, superb. I mean, that's fantastic. I think that's all the questions we had, but I can't let you go before I have a few rapid fire questions with you.
All right,
so are you ready?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Okay. So not many people know, but you did hike at the Everest Base Camp. What were your biggest learning from there?
What's my biggest learning? Anybody can do it, I think, is my takeaway. At the time I did it, I was 25 and in relatively good shape. There was a guy that I saw there who was hiking up, and he was like in his mid 80s and was just taking it slow, but he was killing it. And so there was everybody who was able to do that, and it was phenomenal to see. So that was kind of really inspiring to see somebody at that age doing something that I was doing at 25. And you're like, God, if I can do that 60 years later, then I think I'll be in pretty good shape. So I think that was the takeaway. And the other thing is that the Sherpa people and the Nepalese people are just absolutely phenomenal human beings. So that was definitely a key takeaway for me.
Nice. Which is your favorite book?
Oh, The Lord of the Rings.
Oh, ditto. I love it.
Yeah, I know. It's been my favorite book for a long time. I read them as a kid, and I've read them since. So yeah, big fans. Hard to fault, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, awesome. And since you've been in Southeast Asia for a lot of time, you spent many years there. What's your favorite street food?
Favorite street food? So I'd probably say it would be. So there's a Thai dish called pad kapao, which is like rice and like spicy minced beef with chili and things like that. So yeah, I think that's probably my favorite. That's my go-to street food, mostly because I know how to say it rather than anything else. But it is pretty tasty. So yeah, that probably be my go-to street food.
Awesome. And what's on your bucket list for a dive spot?
Egypt, I think. Egypt would be my.
Oh wow.
Yeah. So the diving in Egypt looked phenomenal. Everybody who I know and who I was an instructor with back in the day, they had been there, or those that had been there said it was amazing. So yeah, diving in Egypt in the Red Sea would be on my bucket list for sure.
I had no idea there was a dive spot near that. Wow, fantastic. Awesome. Alex, it's been great having you. This is such an insightful and fun conversation. How can folks get in touch with you?
So get in touch with me via LinkedIn. You'll see me, I think my LinkedIn profile's on the webinar thing. So yeah, feel free to connect with me there. There's lots of pieces of insight, especially around feedback data and how to kind of use it, more effectively, that myself and the rest of Explory put out as well. So yeah, you can catch up with me on LinkedIn, and feel free to send me a message if you have any questions about how you want to use this.
Awesome. Thank you for your time. And that's a wrap, folks. We come to the end of another session, and we look forward to hearing back from you. We will send out feedback, yes, with our lessons. All right. That's a wrap. Have a good day. Thanks, Alex.
Great. Thank you very much, Ketan. Appreciate it.